Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to talk on party and party systems. This is the second lecture where we are discussing on party and party system. We are going to first recapitulate what we have studied in our previous session, and yes, of course, we are going to talk on the classification of parties as well as some debates would be the part of discussion too. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi, and Dr. Jha is a prolific professor, a productive professor who believes in giving his maximum knowledge to the students. So friends, let's welcome our guest Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, and let's try to understand more about party and party systems. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you Geetika ji, and good afternoon. In fact, this is the second part of our two-part series on party and party system, particularly from the point of view of comparative politics and political science. What I will be doing today is essentially to focus on some of the issues related to classification of political parties and what is normally known as party system, a theory of party system in comparative politics. Because in the first part of our lecture we had essentially looked at this question of that role of parties, what functions they perform, how they have evolved in modern period of time, particularly has become integral to this entire concept of competitive liberal democracy. So this is what we saw in context of the evolution of parties, particularly in Anglo-Saxon world, particularly two important democracies, that is United Kingdom, the Britain, and the United States of America. And subsequently, of course, this entire concept didn't remain confined to these countries, but spread to other parts of the world. And therefore, a number of variations, number of deviations have taken place from what we find in these two countries, these two countries which are referred at times as two parties, system or a democracy based on two party system. But of course, there are certain new developments in Britain, because no longer it can be called strictly a two party system, and other of course deviations are also there so far as party and party system is concerned. But nonetheless, this is what we saw, that how Whigs and Tories, the two important parties, developed in Britain. What was the context, particularly after 16th century, the way this pro-monarchy, the pro-king, which believed in the divine rights of the king, and those who were opposed to this idea, how that resulted into Whigs and Tories, and later on, of course, Whigs merged with Whigs, and Whigs party merged with Liberal Party, and then subsequently Liberal Party's space was occupied by Labour Party. So this is what we saw. And similarly, United States of America, we saw that how this Republicans and Democrats, how they have evolved out of a situation where parties were not considered that important, particularly in aftermath of revolution, or particularly from the point of view of the founders of the American democracy, from the point of view of the framer of, or one can say the writer of the Federalist Papers. So this is what we saw in our last part of our discussion. Now, after looking at this evolution of parties, and as I mentioned earlier also in my first part, that when it reached the third world countries, when it reached the socialist world, of course, there were many new innovations, there are many new modifications. For example, in third world countries, what happened, that anti-colonial movement was spearheaded by one party or other, and therefore what happened, that after independence, when competitive democratic politics was initiated in liberal plural settings, then what happened, that the party which had led freedom movement became a predominant party, as it was called by La Palambra. And therefore this predominant party, for example in Indian context, this was theorized as with different names. Maurice Jones called it one party dominant system, and Rajni Kothari called it Congress system. But nonetheless, the idea behind this entire categorization of predominant party system was that a party which was spearheading the movement, which earned the legitimacy in the eyes of the people, started playing a predominant role after independence in democracy. So this is the concept of predominant party system. Then of course there are many African countries where one party system emerged, largely due to authoritarianism, or perhaps the earlier important role some of these parties had played in decolonization. But nonetheless, a one-party system crystallized. In the socialist world, at the same time, we also find that the similar things happen because, of course, on the question of this party and party system, whatever debates we find are essentially within the liberal tradition and less within the Marxist tradition. Because one thing is to be remembered, that within Marxist tradition, Karl Marx didn't focus much on this question of party or role of political party. In fact, it was only Lenin who came to theorize this entire issue in context of Bolshevik revolution. Particularly, one important work which he produced, one important piece of writing which he produced, that is what is to be done, is a piece of writing on basis of which a number of issues are today theorized within the Marxist tradition on question of representation, political representation, on question of political party, the role of the Communist Party or a vanguard party as it was called by Lenin, the role of party in terms of bringing consciousness among the proletariat, the agent of history, the revolutionary subject, revolutionary agent, and so many other issues which were raised in context of Bolshevik revolution. So it was Lenin who essentially theorized this question of party. But one thing is very clear, that essentially it became a one party system so far as the socialist bloc is concerned. So be it Soviet Union, erstwhile Soviet Union, or today's China, or for example any other country which followed this path or this type of democratic model, be it Cuba, Nicaragua, or any other country in the Latin America. So therefore what happened, that the debate of course initially between Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, the majority and the minority party, particularly in terms of revolutionary vanguard, particularly from the point of view, the question of democratic centralism, because its entire model of democracy is premised on this concept of democratic centralism. Centralism at the top and democracy at the bottom, and therefore bottom up approach of democratic decentralism, which it was essentially called. But what happened, that ultimately it resulted into the concept of one party system, the way we have referred to the cases in Africa and some of the Latin American countries. Of course there were many dissenting voices. The Trotsky, particularly the way he critiqued this entire concept of vanguardism, the way he criticized the entire entire concept of democratic centralism, and the way he basically pointed out that how whole of state bureaucracy started increasing on the functioning of democratic institutions, and how this entire party machinery got bureaucratized. So this was some sort of debate within Marxism so far as the party and party system is concerned. But as I was mentioning, that essentially this debate on the question of party and party system has materialized within the liberal tradition, and therefore in fact whatever debates, whatever writings, whatever ideas we have, they mostly, the scholars, the thinkers who have contributed on it, they mostly subscribe to liberal ideological framework or liberal tradition. So this is something, in fact, is important, because within Marxism, it was a party was seen through the prism of class, whereas the liberal democratic tradition considers party as a multi-class, organization. In fact, class theory, of course, would assume that every class has to have a party, but that is not feasible, that is not practicable, and that is perhaps not happen even in a socialist society, because more than one class combined, classes got combined together to form even, the proletarian party, that is the socialist or the communist party. So this is something we should remember. Now, of course, party is a combination of different types of things within democracy. In fact, class, of course, is different from group, and political party, of course, as I mentioned in my last lecture and discussed it, that how it is different from interest group and pressure group. How interest articulation is not only the concern or the function of political party, interest aggregation is equally important. So therefore, we have to see that how this entire concept of party is different from class, which is essentially entry point of the Marxist theory so far as the question of party and party system is concerned. But one thing is to be remembered, that which we touched upon in our last lecture, and that is the functions of political party. As I mentioned, that there are different functions of political party. It starts with interest, elites recruitment. It starts with government formation. It goes to many other issues. For example, issues like that how it leads to a kind of representation of different interests in political system, how a goal formulation is done by political party, how aggregation and interest articulation and aggregation, of course they are two important things. Then socialization, particularly political socialization and mobilization. These are also important functions of political parties. And finally, we can say that this the function of party, of course, is to in terms of goal setting the goals before the policy makers before the policy framers. So these are some of the functions of political parties. Now, one thing we should remember, that this party, the way it has evolved. In fact, there are two scholars, Lipset and Rocken, who in 1967 writing, argued that this entire the way parties have evolved in history, in modern period of time, they have basically resulted from number of cleavages, which crystallized, which surfaced in social, political, and economic, particularly social and economic sphere and cultural sphere. Those cleavages gave rise to, or basically built the foundation for parties. And they point out that in 19th century, a century which was the century or the period for a national movement, what happened, or national revolution, when nation states got consolidated. In fact, the two important cleavages which played important role, where one cleavage was around center and periphery, another cleavage was around church and state. As we discussed it in context of Britain, that how the parties, political parties evolved in Britain in context of this church-state debate between the parliament and the king. So therefore, these two cleavages, center and periphery, particularly from the cities, industrial centers, and the peripheries, that is the agricultural sector, and another the church and state. This is the 19th century. Then they point out that the next round of cleavage was around agriculture and industry and employee and worker. And particularly in late 19th century, these were the two important cleavages. Of course, two different interests. Agriculture, the interests of those who were dependent on agriculture, and interest of those who were dependent on industry. And another sort of cleavage was employee and a worker. And this is how perhaps this entire discourse, socialist discourse, emerged in modern times. Particularly the workers' interests, how they can be organized, how they can be mobilized, how they can be articulated. In fact, to some extent, one can say that some of the ideological, articulations of such cleavages we could see in Fabian socialists, in guild socialists and syndicalists, how they believed that the people should be organized on workplace. There should be a separate organizational structure related to the workplace, and it is this employee and worker cleavage we can see best getting articulated with the formation of Labour Party in Britain. So therefore, this was another important cleavage. Of course, the agriculture industry is well known. That cleavage is still continuing. That the rural, the agrarian interest versus the industrial interest. And this was the late 19th century. And then they point out that the next round of cleavage was in the 20th century, particularly in context of Bolshevik revolution, which talked about international revolution or a revolution of the proletariat in the entire world. So therefore, this was in light of this Bolshevik revolution that this new cleavage characterized the formation of political party. And then they point out that the post, of course, they of course have concentrated on these 4 types of cleavages which I mentioned: center, periphery, church, state, agriculture, industry, and employee and worker. But later cleavages have also been highlighted by other scholars. For example, this one cleavage, as I have mentioned, this Bolshevik revolution and the international, the revolution in Soviet Union, how it, characterized another type of formation of party in light of this proletariat revolution at the world scale. And the second was the post-industrial revolution, particularly in 60s and 70s, and where we find new dichotomy, coming into politics, which is normally referred as materialist and the post-materialist cleavage. And then, of course, the third important recent cleavage of the 20th century. If the other cleavages were of 19th century, then the last 2-3 cleavages, one can say, that occurred in 20th century. And the third one is the cleavage, political cleavage, which surfaced in the backdrop of globalization, particularly 90s, and it has continued in 21st century, particularly around the issue of opening up the market, issue of immigration, particularly from the point of view of supranational integration and identity problems and identity discourse and so on and so forth. So these are some of the new issues resulting out of in the backdrop of this entire debate and entire issue around globalization. So this is a third type of cleavage. So therefore, if there are 4 different types of cleavages which were highlighted by Lifshitz and Rocken in 1967 in context of 19th and late 19th century, then we find that 3 different types of cleavages we can see in context of 20th and 21st century. Now it is in this context that number of issues have been debated with reference to political party, and particularly from the point of view of their functioning. But before I move to this issue of classification, that how scholars have tried to classify political parties, particularly in terms of number, and what are the arguments about those classifications, there are 2 important theories so far as classification of political parties is concerned. One is Duverger, another is Sartori, and we will be discussing both of them. But there are few issues, which are also, at times debated when we discuss party and party system. One is, of course, the question of internal democracy of political parties. And this internal democracy is a very important issue, that parties are essentially meant to play a democratic role within a liberal pluralist settings. But whether parties and their functioning is democratic, if rank and file gets adequate and ample opportunity to participate in the process, if there is a process through which there is a mobilization from bottom to the up, where the ordinary members of the party can think of rising at the top. So these issues related to this functioning of party, internal party democracy, is a very important issue, and that issue is as important today as perhaps when someone like Michels, particularly in his book Political Party in 1911, theorized this question. So before I move to this question of classification of parties, and particularly Duverger and Sartori on this issue of classification, but because there are 2-3 important issues apart from classification in Sartori and Duverger. Duverger, apart from classifying the parties, he also talked about types of parties, and along with that he also made a very ambitious, attempt to relate electoral system with political party, which at times is referred as Duverger's law, or another iron law on the question of political party, because the first iron law is associated with Michels, particularly from the point of view of iron law of oligarchy in terms of the functioning of political parties, or the internal democracy or inner democracy within political party, or chances of ordinary members to rise to the higher position. So before I move to Duverger and Sartori, let's have some ideas about this Duverger's iron law of oligarchy, Michels' iron law of oligarchy, and what he wants to convey through his theory. Now, of course, one thing is very clear here, that when you talk of oligarchy, we simply mean by oligarchy, or this is what Michels meant by this, that it is totally, opposed to democracy, because oligarchy is basically rule of few. whereas democracy means the rule of many. So therefore, this rule of few stands for oligarchy. And therefore, when we talk of oligarchy, that means that this entire tendency is against this spirit of democracy. Now, Robert Mitchell in 1911, as I was mentioning, wrote a book called Political Parties. And it is in this book that he propounded the theory that iron law is inevitable tendency, and that iron law is the law towards the formation of an oligarchy in every political party. And Mitchell deduced this theory or this argument from his study of the structure and functions of a German Social Democratic Party, that is SPD, and he made it a test case that how this theory can be validated or this argument can be validated, that there is a general inevitable tendency of this iron law of oligarchy. Now, argument of Mitchell's was very simple. The argument was that behind the formal democratic organization of party, there is concentration of power only in handful of party leaders, and therefore he argued that only the facade of democracy is presented, but in fact it is the contrary. Basically, the power is concentrated in handful of people. Now, Robert Mackenzie, particularly in his book British Political Parties in 1955, revisited this issue and proved that the perception of Conservative Party as elitist and and leader-centric, whereas Labour Party as a party of internal democracy is a myth. And Mackenzie's argument was that despite their different structures and ideologies and value system, the distribution of power in both political parties in Britain was same. And therefore, what Mitchell had argued, in fact, he tried to validate on basis of his study of the Labour and Conservative Party in Britain. Now, of course, what happened, that Mackenzie's argument was that the both parties are dominated by a small group of leaders, and therefore what Mitchell had argued in 1911 was even true in 1955 when Mackenzie wrote this book on British party system. Now, what are the arguments of Mitchell's, particularly for this iron law of oligarchy? This is something to be discussed, or something deserves a discussion. Because what happened, that Mitchell's argument, even today it is remembered when we talk of internal party democracy or the functioning of political parties, that whether majority of the members of the parties have equal chance to rise to the top, they have equal chance to wield political power, or power is ultimately wielded by only the elites within a party, a handful of people, what Mitchell called oligarchic group within a party. Now, Mitchell's argument was basically threefold. The first, that the elite groups result from a need for specialization, that it is basically compulsion. Because what happened, that there are certain people within every political party who are expert of different issues. They have a specialization, they have the skill, they have the expertise, and therefore they are better organizational skills than other members of the party, and therefore they put them in an advantageous situation. And therefore, willy-nilly what happened, whether the ordinary members of the party want it or not, they occupy a privileged position. The second argument was that leaders, particularly these leaders, there are some leaders within every political party who form a cohesive group, and therefore what happens, that this cohesion within this group also puts them in a privileged position, because what happened, that their cohesion also perhaps ensures that they remain at the center of gravity, or they remain at the center of the power structure. And the third was the rank and file within a party at times also becomes apathetic, because the apathy sets in, and therefore what happened, that they are generally disposed to accept the subordinate, or one can say a subordinate role vis-a-vis their leaders. They venerate their leaders, they adore their leaders, they look towards leaders for direction and guidance. They, instead of trying to replace them, they simply try to follow them. So therefore, these are the three different reasons which were cited by Mitchell in support of this argument. Later on, we find that a scholar called Mozy Ostrogowski, particularly in his book Democracy and Organization of Political Parties, in fact also highlighted this issue. In fact, one can say that this was one of the earliest attempt to investigate internal democracy, even even earlier than Mitchell's, because this book was published in 1902, and Mitchell's, of course, published the book later, that is basically 1911. So one can say that Ostrogowski was the first important attempt in this direction, and his argument was that the representation of individual interests had lost out to the growing influence of party machine and the control of caucus within the political party. So therefore, in fact, one can say that what Ostrogowski had initially argued, Mitchell's picked up and built his theory of iron law of oligarchy on this, and Mackenzie validated it. But one can say that this is a very important contribution from the point of view of inner party democracy or the functioning of party. In the second part of our discussion, we will be taking up Duverger and Chartori, particularly their classification of parties.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, we will be back after a short break and would be discussing more. Till then, keep watching us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on party and party system. In our previous session also we discussed a lot, and in this session also here we are, as per the promise, we are going to discuss more on the classification of the parties. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is an eminent professor of political science, and we believe that we always get in-depth knowledge from him. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, and let's try to grab maximum knowledge through him. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you. In the earlier part of our discussion, we were looking at this question of party and party system, and we had discussed inner party, internal party functioning of political parties, and the Mitchell's argument that how it invariably leads to kind of a handful of people wielding power, which he called an inevitable tendency towards oligarchy, and which has come to be known in comparative politics as Mitchell's iron law of oligarchy. Now, what we should remember that Mitchell's argument has also been put to test, and the arguments have been also criticized. The first criticism is that the generalization on basis of one single political party, which Mitchell's did, that was basically the German Social Democratic Party, is not proper, and that is particularly from particular point of time when he was doing this study. The second is that it is based on questionable psychological theories, and the third is that political elites often prove to be more faction-ridden than perhaps Mitchell's make us to believe, because it is not that elites are always homogeneous and there is no conflict of interest. So therefore, these are some of the arguments. And then of course there are scholars who also point out that over the years attempts have been made to reform political parties so far their functioning is concerned. And in this context, a reference is often made of United States of America of 1968, when Democratic Party initiated this reform in Chicago and tried to particularly give important role to ordinary members. And accordingly, we find that there are other countries have also been seized of this matter. But nonetheless, one thing is very true, that in spite of this reformist agenda, in fact, this lack of inner party democracy is a problem which plagues most of the political parties in the world. So therefore, these criticisms are there, but nonetheless, that does not diminish Mitchell's argument to great extent, that because by the nature of their expertise, because of nature of of the functioning of party, the logic through which some people, some groups within party occupy a privileged place, that such tendencies develop. Now, the most rigorous criticism of Mitchell's theory was put forth by Lipset, particularly when he did a comparative study of one trade union of United States of America, that is Universal Postal Union, and one political party of Canada, and tried to put this entire Mitchell's argument of iron law of oligarchy on test. And Lipset's argument was that there is no oligarchy as per the claim made by Mitchell, because all parties are faction ridden, and factions gradually develop in all political parties. And number two, the competition, that is democratic competition among these factions are, these competitions are order of the day, and no political party is immune from it. So therefore, the criticism of Lipset was that on basis of his study of these two political formations, a trade union organization of United States of America, Universal Postal Union, and a Canadian political party, he argued that this argument was not valid, and therefore we should not look at political parties as a monolithic homogeneous whole, or the elites among them as a homogeneous whole. So this is how we have to see that how Mitchell's argument, Mitchell's theory have from time to time been criticized, have been rigorously put to test, and different types of arguments are available, and Lipset is perhaps one very significant argument from that point of view. Now, that brings us to the next question which we mentioned in the beginning, that is the classification of parties. And when we talk of classification of parties, there are two important parties, two important thinkers or two important theorists on this issue. One is Duverger, and who basically wrote a book in 1951, which is considered to be very authoritative, and another which came from Sartori, which was produced in 1976. So therefore, Duverger and Sartori, these two in fact scholars, and their classification are normally discussed, debated, and they draw a lot of attention in comparative politics and political science. Now, Duverger has given a typology of parties, and of course, particularly in terms of organization, Duverger has highlighted two important dimensions. One is that whether the structure is based on direct membership or indirect membership. Indirect membership, that there are many parties today where membership is procured through indirect means. First of all, you become a member of that group, and automatically your membership of the political party also comes your way. That is basically the indirect channel. Then there is a direct, where you don't have to come to a party through indirect channels, through number of other branches, through number of other organizations. There are number of frontal organizations. In fact, if you want to be a member of party, you have to secure the membership directly. So therefore, this is a direct. So therefore, in terms of structure, Duverger makes a distinction between direct and indirect pattern of membership or recruitment within political party. In fact, but so far as both direct and indirect types of parties are concerned, Duverger argue that both direct and indirect parties are composed of four different types of things, and they are called, according to Duverger, Duverger calls them caucus, branch, cell and militia. And these are the 4 different types available both in direct and indirect pattern of recruitment in political parties. Now, what is this caucus party? Now, of course, according to Diverger, this is the earliest form of party. Because parties when it emerged as a caucus, and this is a caucus means a small organization of like-minded people. Of course, this expansion of this caucus also takes place, particularly through tacit cooption, of people or a formal nomination within that caucus by those who are important within. And therefore, what happened that a group of political elites is put in place, or a group of political elites gets formed, and they act as a caucus. And caucus parties, in fact, according to Diverger, are highly decentralized with loose organization. In fact, what happened that in legislative assembly, particularly in pre-democratic period or pre-democratic phase, when democracy was in its nascent stage, this caucus party made first, or the caucus tendency or the caucus organization made its first appearance. The second type, which according to Diverger is a branch party, or the branches. First is the caucus, the second is branch. And what he says that these branches are based on mass membership. In fact, one can say that recruitment is attempted in order to enhance the resources, because resources is also a very important consideration for every political party. So branch parties are closely interlinked with central control and regulation. That is basically what is normally called in political parties, or in that parlance, a high command. So they are basically closely interlinked with the central control and regulatory machinery, or regulatory authority of the party. Now, branch parties originated outside parliamentary arena by those who were excluded from the parliamentary politics, and therefore this branch party in fact first of all surfaced in context of socialist discourse. Particularly socialist parties emerged as a branch party because they emerged outside this legislative or parliamentary politics, because they made entry into parliamentary politics only later. So therefore, this is the second instance. The first one, the caucus, is a pre-democratic period, particularly in legislative assembly, the caucus and as a group made appearance, whereas this branch made appearance with the emergence and popularity of the socialist discourse. The third is the cell, and here it is basically invention of the communist parties, particularly the way they surfaced in Soviet Union, and the way they surfaced in China, and the way they surfaced in other countries, which is basically shown in name of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. So therefore, this cell is an invention of communist party. Now, what happens that here in cell, quality is more important than number, and what happens that admission in the cell party is always centralized, unlike the branch party, where it is more open, more decentralized, but in cell party it is always centralized. The fourth is, of course, but one thing is also important about the cell party. The key organizational unit is not linked to geography but to the workplace, and this is it is in this context that I was referring to syndicalist and the guild socialist ideology or the theories which talked about organizing people on basis of workplace, and therefore this cell party also this is a key organizational unit. That is the work, not geography linked to geography like other political parties in democracy, but to the workplace. Every workplace will have a cell. For example, cell for industrial workers, cell for farmers, cell for professionals, cell for different workplaces. Now, what happened that election in this type of party, that is cell party, forms only a small part of its setup. The main functioning is this interest articulation. They function more as a interest groups, and therefore what happened that in cell parties, what happens that a new concept also got developed. That is the concept of whole timers, which is normally associated, initially it was associated with the left political parties or the socialist and the communist party, the whole timers, that workers becoming full-time activists in fact, their requirement, day-to-day life requirement was also met or was taken care of the parent political party. So the concept of whole timer also emerged out of this concept of cell party. And the fourth is, according to Duverger, is militia. And this origin, of course, is fascist, in nature, because what happened that extreme right-wing groups, particularly between the two world wars, the fascism and Nazism, the way they surfaced in Germany and Italy, they created a party structure pattern on this militia. Therefore, in what happened that in parties pattern on militia, there is no link between electoral politics and the formation of political party. In fact, they act like a private army. Now we hear many things about private armies in different countries, but these militia type parties, they function on pattern of a private army, and recruitment, of course, is also done along military lines. The way people are inducted in military, similar pattern of recruitment we find in these political parties, both in terms of composition and structure. And of course, what happens as a result that this militia type parties or militia based parties or militia pattern, and the parties use a pattern on militia, their entire structure is pyramidal, where you have the base is wide but the top is quite narrow. So this is how these four different types of parties were discussed by Duverger. Now Duverger, of course, had some biases. For example, for him the British party system is better than Caucus Party, which is normally associated with the American party system. And cell and militia parties, according to Duverger, are ideological, and therefore they often remain on fringe in the liberal democracy. So therefore liberal democracy was his preference, and within liberal democracy his main preference was the British party system. Duverger also made a distinction between cadre party and the mass party. Of course, cadre party, he argues, was the invention of 18th century, particularly when these liberals and the conservatives came into existence. The mass parties, of course, is a 20th century phenomenon, particularly after extension of franchise happened. More and more people got enfranchised. Women suffrage came into existence, and therefore what happened that this extension of franchise consolidated or rather widened this entire ambit of the political parties, when most of the political parties became mass parties, when different sections of society started participating in their functioning and their process. So mass parties are, according to Duverger, are large. They are also disposed towards middle class financial support, unlike the cadre party, which is more restrictive, and therefore they essentially rely on donations from select individuals. So mass and cadre parties have to be seen in terms of openness and closeness, and in terms of financial support that where from they get. Mass parties, as I was mentioning, get support from the middle class, particularly the financial support from wide spectrum of people, particularly the middle class who can afford to finance it. Whereas the cadre party is more restrictive and essentially relies from the donation from select people, particularly those who are its cadre, those who are within its organizational structure. Now after looking at this classification, Duverger's another important contribution is on issue of electoral competition and political party, what is also today known as Duverger's law, or particularly in terms of the party system or party formation. What is this? We have seen Mitchell's law, iron law of oligarchy. Now Duverger's law of electoral system and party formation. Now of course, it was key to this entire theory of party organization. In fact, what happened that Epstein, one scholar called Epstein in 1980, he wrote a book and made a very important observation. He said that party organizations were shaped in response to competition for votes, because the way they compete for votes with each other, they largely shape the functioning of the parties, or they shape the structure of parties within a polity. Now, of course, Duverger, for American party system, he, as I mentioned, that believed that was a continuation of caucus system, and therefore he also believed that American polity never witnessed a challenge from the Socialist Party, and therefore what happened that the British system, according to him, is perhaps the best we can think of within liberal democracy, whereas Epstein considered American party system the best in terms of electoral campaign or best suited for electoral politics within democracy. So these are some of the debates around his biases, that which one is better, European, the British or the American. But instead of spending more time on this, let's have this electoral system and party which is at times presented as iron law of Duverger. What is that iron law of Duverger? The first law is that first post the past system will give rise to two parties, and the proportional representation system will give rise to multi-party system. So this is his law, that invariably if you have a plurality system, which is also called first past the post system, would give rise to two parties. And if you have a proportional representation system has many variations, list system, hair system, and so on and so forth, that will give rise to multi-party system. Now, William Riker, writing later, has reinforced this Duverger's law and believes that what Duverger said is fully justified. But we have to look at this question slightly more seriously, that how Duverger looks at this question, because here he makes establishes a relationship in electoral system and political party. Now, of course, according to Duverger, due to the impact of party systems fragmentation, what happened that three things happens in a polity. Stability gets affected, accountability comes under stress, and therefore representation also suffers. And one thing we should know, that most of the writings, most of the researches in comparative politics on number and size of parties have basically emerged because of these three things, because the main mission is to look at three issues: stability, accountability, and representation. That whether proliferation of parties is good for stability, good for accountability, good for representation or not. So therefore this question has always been addressed by scholars in comparative politics. Now, from that point of view, let's turn to Duverger. Now, what happens that we should remember here, that as I mentioned, that he is the first important thinker who has associated electoral system with the party system. And electoral system is nothing but mechanism for translating the preferences into votes, and votes into the seats, and ultimately seats into the formation of government. Now, electoral system, there are two types, as I mentioned. One is called first post, one is the first post the past system, which is called majoritarian system with single member constituency, and another is the proportional representation system with a multi-member constituency. So normally the distinction is between these two types: the single member and multi-member with one is majoritarian system, the first past the post, another is proportional representation system. The best known formulation on the causal relationship between electoral system and party system, as I was mentioning, has been put forth by Duverger in 1954 book, that is Political Party. Now the laws, what laws he propound, the Duverger's law. The first law is that simple plurality or majoritarian electoral system favors two-party system. And the second law is proportional representation system, that is the system in which seats are distributed in proportion to their vote share, that favors multi-party system. Now, relationship between electoral and party system happens according to Duverger because of two effects. And the first is he calls mechanical effect, and the second he calls psychological effect. What is that mechanical effect? The mechanical effect is that due to the formula used to translate votes into seat in plurality system, that is first post the past system, single member constituency, winning becomes difficult. Party with most votes win, but other parties are always at a disadvantageous position. The second, third and fourth parties do not get any seat in this system. Threshold is very high at the constituency level, because in order to get seats or in order to win, you have to cross that threshold. And therefore, all but the first ones get eliminated. So therefore, this is a mechanical effect, that why two parties always emerge in this plurality system, the first post-past system. In proportional representation, on the other hand, what happened? Seats are allotted in proportion to votes. Whatever votes you get, whether you are a small party or a big party. Smaller parties are not eliminated altogether. If you get 5% votes, then you should be rest assured that you will get 5% seats, which is not going to happen in this first post the past system. Therefore, parties making into the parliament, even a smaller parties making into parliament, are always high. The second is the psychological effect, the behavior of voting and parties. And here he talks about two sides, the demand side and the supply side. Demand side stands for the voters, and the supply side stands from the parties, the point of view of voters and party. On demand side, that is voters, Duverger would argue that vote is strategically, people vote strategically, not to waste their votes, because they know that if they vote for smaller parties, their vote is going to waste it, because that party is not going to win. So therefore they vote only for large parties and not necessarily their first choice party. Even if they choose their choice is for the smaller party, the first choice is for smaller party, still they will not vote, because they feel that the vote will be wasted. And number two, the voters what happened, they converge their votes to large parties in order to be on the side of those parties which are going to win, and therefore that reduces the number of parties, because the smaller parties stand no chance. Whereas in proportional representation system, even small parties can win seats, because the seats are assured, or rather ensured, in proportion to your vote share. Voters here vote according to Duverger sincerely, not strategically. Whereas in the first past post system, they vote strategically. They vote only for those parties which have a chance to cross the threshold, those who have chance to win. But in proportional representation system, they vote sincerely, they go by their preferences. Even if the party is small, but still they will vote if the party comes as the first preference party, because they know that vote is not going to be wasted. And result, you have a proliferation of parties, large number of parties, and therefore in proportional representation system you have multi-party system, where in the first past the post system you have chances of two-party system. On supply side, this was a demand side argument. Supply side argument, that is from the point of view of parties, Duverger would argue that with plurality system, small parties have an incentive to merge with other parties to increase their chances of passing the threshold, because if they are splintered, they are not together, then they cannot cross the threshold and they have little chance to win. Therefore they come together, they basically close their ranks, and therefore what happens, that number of parties are reduced in first post the past system, and therefore normally the chances are the two-party system will emerge. Similarly, in proportional representation system, the supply side argument according to Duverger, that is from the point of view of party, would be that no incentive to merge, because even they remain small, even if they get less number of percentage of votes, still they can survive, and therefore smaller parties do not suffer on account of this system, and they continue as a splinter parties, small parties, and therefore the result is that you have an increase in number of parties. Now, criticism of this entire argument of Duverger, electoral and party system, have also been given by many scholars, including Roy in 1977, Riker in 1982, Chartery in 1986, and they question this law. The first question they pose is whether the reductive effect of majoritarian electoral system works at constituency level or national level, because this is not clear in Duverger, because this entire supply side, demand side, psychological factor, all these operate at the constituency level or the national level. And secondly, at the constituency level, high threshold reduces number of parties, that is there to see from the argument. But does this always translate into reduction in the national level? This remains unanswered. Now, Chartery argues that the condition is important, which has not been addressed by Duverger, and that condition is that majoritarian system produces two-party system at national level only if parties are nationalized and get homogeneous support in all constituencies, perhaps the way it happens in some countries. But if they are not nationalized, if their following is not totally homogenized across constituencies, then this law may not operate. If parties with territorial concentration support, then what happens according to Sartori? It leads to fragmentation in national party system. And therefore, this divergence law that there will be two-party system in first post the past will not stand the scrutiny. And a party which is small at national level can be strong in some regions and some constituencies, and therefore they may win seats, and fragmentation of parties may take place. So therefore, what has happened that divergence, this law has been questioned from the point of view of reductionist tendency, or particularly from the point of view of constituency and national level, presence of the parties, whether the presence is territorially concentrated or it is basically nationally located. So this is what we find criticism come from Sartori. Now, mid-19th century, what happened? That party system got nationalized, and therefore support was also homogenized, and therefore this new, what can I say, divergence law made some sense. Particularly, scholars give example of North America, India, and Latin America. But plurality system, it is true that distorts party votes, because parties do not get seats as per their vote share. But what has happened that over the years, divergence law has been defied by many countries, including India and Canada. Canada between 1993 to 2003 definitely defied this divergence law of electoral and party system. Even Britain today, one can say, is a multi-party system for last 10 years, and classical home of two-party system has defied it. India, of course, is a classic case of this defiance. So this is how divergence theory has been analyzed. Of course, there is also Sartori's theory of classification, where he takes number and ideology both, that how on basis of number 7 different types of parties emerge, one party system, hegemonic party system, predominant party system, two-party system, then limited pluralism, extreme pluralism, and atomized pluralism. And then, of course, he makes a distinction on basis of ideology in terms of intensity and distance. In one party system, he believes that is always intensity of ideology which plays important role. But in multi-party system, it is always the distance. And he says that moderate pluralism and polarized pluralism are the two features of party system based on this distance factor on basis of ideology in multi-party system. Because polarized pluralism, fragmentation is quite polarized, while a moderate pluralism, fragmentation is not that much polarized. So these are some of the classifications given by Sartori on political parties. I will stop here.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session. And friends, you can give your feedback at info.cec@nic.in. For this particular lecture, we are going to meet soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.